All right. So, so thanks for being here. We're here to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've all been hearing about for sure in the news about the proposed governor's budget for fiscal year 26, which is the year that will start this summer and be through next summer. And we have sort of two buckets of things to talk about, the cuts to the Developmental Disabilities Administration, and then that serve about 20,000 Marylanders with intellectual and developmental disabilities through Medicaid waiver services. And then the threats to education funding, specifically to the Blueprint. And what we're going to do is talk a little bit about what those threats are, and then some ideas around how you can respond, and we can respond collectively as communities. This session today is open to all kinds of folks. So there may be people who are only interested in the education side, who are only interested in the DDA, but we're going to cover it all. So hopefully, so just to sort of set the stage that's the intention for today. Um, okay, so here's what we're going to do tonight. Welcome, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the purpose. I'm going to walk through a little bit of kind of budget basics, the way that the budget happens every year. I'm going to talk specifically about the cuts to the DDA, and then the cuts to education, and then give you some specifics about what we can each do and what we can do collectively. Some important dates to keep in mind about when we can take action. And it says questions at the end, but again, please, if you have a question, just come off mute and ask. I'm not going to be able to see hands necessarily, so please do just feel free to let me know that you have a question. And so I will share these slides afterwards, and more importantly, I'm going to put together probably later tonight a list of resources that have a lot of different details that will be helpful, I think, in the coming weeks. All right. So, all right. So, our purpose. We're going to talk a lot about the context of this moment in this for this budget cut. But what I wanted to talk about was how these two pieces, the DDA cuts and the cuts to public education, are really part of the same story, and why families in particular are really situated in a really important place. So the situation that we find ourselves in today, with hundreds of millions of dollars being potentially cut from the DDA and from public education, and for public education, that impact snowballing into literally billions of dollars in the course of a couple of years. Both of those situations are arising for a similar reason, which is that people identified an area where our state was not adequately supporting people. And the DDA was one, and our public school system was
Ridiculous.
and hey, could everybody mute if possible? Thanks. Over a period of years, we had commissions, or we did studies. We brought together experts and stakeholders. People came to the table and talked about what we needed to do to have a better system to support people with developmental disabilities, to have what ended up being a plan to have the best public schools in the country. And so we brought together all these stakeholders and experts, and the state made a commitment and came up with a plan. In the case of education, it was passed as legislation, and it's called the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. For the DDA, it had to do with a glide path to improving rates that are paid to direct support professionals over time to make sure that there would be people who could support people with developmental disabilities, and that it paid enough that there would be a workforce there. So we made this commitment and we made these plans. And then, the pandemic happened, was one obviously thing that, blew up a lot of plans. And people with disabilities and kids arguably were the two groups that were hurt the most by the pandemic. During the pandemic, a lot of providers in the DDA world really struggled. It was difficult, and individuals with disabilities who couldn't access the supports that they needed, they really struggled, and kids struggled. And after sort of the acute phase of the pandemic, we face a lot of different challenges. Inflation, is a big factor in all of this. As a state, we decided to not only raise the minimum wage, but Governor Moore decided to accelerate how quickly we were raising the minimum wage, and that's placed additional pressures on the system. So now we find ourselves today in this difficult budget situation, and without stakeholder input, without having a big dialogue like we did in developing those plans, there's been these big proposed cuts. And so I know that it's left a lot of us feeling frustrated, feeling scared about what's going to happen. And so, we are in the middle of a process, and what I'm hoping that we can get to tonight is to have you really understand where we are in the process and how you can plug into it and participate in it. So we're going to talk about the impact. We're going to talk about how we're going to act. And we're also going to think about how there's a much broader context, right? There's the things that are going on in our country right now, which has also left a lot of people feeling very unsure. And frankly, our state government feeling very unsure about the funding and support that they are going to get from the federal government moving forward. And that is putting all of us on even shakier ground. So our purpose tonight is to really try to understand what we can about these really complicated challenges, and then how we can plug in and participate in them, and to make sure that as families, we are heard. So I just wanted to give a little bit of very basic information about the budget, and I'm not an expert, but just a couple things that I have taken away that might be helpful. So first of all, in Maryland, we have to pass a balanced budget every year in the 90-day session of the House and the Senate. They have to pass by the end of that 90-day session a budget that is balanced, which means it takes in as much money as it plans to spend. So the budget process begins by the governor proposing a budget to the legislature. And that's what was done with a lot of fanfare on January the 15th. When it goes then to the House and to the Senate, over the course of the session, there'll be things that are passed that require additional money. There'll be cuts that are made. They'll add and subtract and add and subtract. And at the end, what they pass has to be balanced. It won't necessarily be the same as what the governor proposed, but he sort of puts the first proposal on the table. And then there's a lot of wrangling over the course of the 3 months. So in this year, we are starting at this point of a lot of challenge, and you've probably heard this number, $3 billion shortfall, thrown around a lot. So we have what is called a growing structural deficit, which means Maryland is spending more money than it's taking in. And when you have a structural deficit, there's two things you can do. You can either cut spending, or you can take in more revenue, which means raise taxes. The governor's budget proposal has $2 billion in cuts and $1 billion in new revenue generation. Okay. So let's get into the cuts to the DDA. And this is going to be I'm sure many of you know a lot more about this. This is just to sort of lay a foundation so everybody is kind of has a little bit of information to kind of understand what we're talking about. So the proposed budget would cut $194 million in the current fiscal year, which is actually the fiscal year that we're in the middle of right now. So it would make changes to um, expected expenditures that the DDA would spend this year before July 1, which is when the next fiscal year starts. And then it would proposes about what would amount to about $457 million of cuts to next fiscal year. And that amounts to almost a quarter of what the of DDA community supports. So one thing to consider when we're thinking about this is that the state savings, and I put that in quote because I don't think that really the state saves, but in the budget document, what is saved is about half of the amounts that you see here on the screen. And that's because the impact to the community is twice the cut in the budget. And this is why the state expends money for Medicaid waiver services, and there's a match that the federal government does for those services. So if the state cuts that money, we also lose that money from the federal government. And one kind of piece of context to keep in mind is that you may have heard folks talking about the idea of block granting Medicaid, which is an idea that's been floated before, and we'll probably be hearing a lot more about it in the next few months. But the idea of that is that the federal government, instead of doling out Medicaid dollars the way they do now, would have a whole amount that they would give to each state, and then the state can kind of do with it as they wish, rather than administering it more centrally the way the federal government does now. One concern that's been raised is that if we cut money out of our state budget for DD services and lower our federal match right now, that lower amount of what we are taking from the federal government will become the base of our federal match going forward. So that's just there's a lot of ifs in there, but that's just something to keep in mind. So what specifically are the cuts to the DDA? So these have been referred to as cost containment. And again, I put that in quotes. A lot of euphemisms being used to talk about cuts that impact human beings. But here are a few of the areas where there are proposed changes to the DDA. One is a change to something called the dedicated hours policy. And this has to do with people who require a certain number of hours of dedicated support for having a direct support professional provide support just to them. And the proposal is that a provider you would first have to use up all of the shared hours that a group of people may have together where they're sharing a support before they can use their dedicated hours. And it really is will have a lot of impact on people who will not be able to have the level of support, intensity of support that they may need. And it takes a lot of autonomy away from people to live lives of dignity and autonomy as they choose. And also, I think will impact just the kind of support that people need. Another, and one that's a lot of people have talked a lot about, is this elimination of the geographic differential rate, which is a fancy way of saying in different parts of the state, there's two areas of our state where the rate that a direct support professional is paid based on their providers is different because it was determined doing a study that there's an area of our state, mostly around kind of Washington, D.C., where it's more expensive. The cost of living is more expensive. And so that that elimination of a geographic differential rate would mean that everybody, all the providers have to pay the same amount. Um, and there's a lot of concern that a lot of people who are currently in those positions will leave if they have a big pay cut, and that providers, which are small businesses that are, built around wages and benefits and all the ways that they support people and pay them, that they will potentially go out of business in some of these areas. There's a couple different pieces here that have to do with self-direction. So specifically, one is the change to reasonable and customary rate, the wage allowance, and the other is elimination of the wage exception process. And both of those have to do with people who are self-directing their services being allowed to raise wages for people who are supporting them for a series of reasons. Maybe that person has pretty exceptional need, and they need to pay someone with particular expertise. Or maybe they live somewhere far away and it's hard to get to, and so they have to entice someone to do that extra drive or commute. Maybe they only need a very limited window, a very small period of time, and to make it worth it for someone to get all the way to them, support them for 2 hours and then leave, they're going to pay a higher hourly rate. So those kinds of things. Another area of potential change is a cap to individual and family directed goods and services. And that actually was something that was discussed a lot last year. And then the last one on this list, there's I think a few other other kind of in the weeds ones, but the other one is the elimination of low intensity support services, which is a program that gives small grants of $2,000 via lottery system twice a year to families, to individuals who have a developmental disability and don't get any other DDA services. And so those little grants can be used for all kinds of things. They might be used to build a fence for safety. They might be used to buy a piece of assistive technology, to do some supplemental therapy, or to do therapeutic riding, or that kind of thing. A summer camp. So, and then just a little bit of context on kind of the DDA piece. So over the past year plus, there's really been a breakdown in communication between the advocacy community, the provider community, the different organizations that maybe many of you are probably part of and connected to, and the DDA and the Department of Health. And that's made it difficult to solve problems as they arise, and to be in communication about where there may need to be some tweaks or changes over time. So and it's led to a real breakdown in trust, which is really difficult. And I'm sure many of you have experienced, and I have just heard about as an advocate, a lot that there have been a lot of changes that have happened as computer systems have changed and different processes have changed, and it's been really difficult, and things have not gone well. It hasn't not gone smoothly, and it's been really challenging, and then to not have that breakdown in communication at the same time has meant that we're already in a place of a lot of frustration, and a lot of fear. which is a difficult place to be when you're confronting a big challenge like this budget challenge. There's also been a lot of sort of silent cuts that have been happening where people's individual plans they've had denials of particular services. And those kinds of things, they don't show up in a budget document, but they impact people's lives. And they're not something that, for instance, legislators are going to know if families don't communicate them. And then lastly, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of uncertainty about the changes at the federal level. And then I'm sure that everybody heard, but just to reiterate here, last Thursday it was announced that the Department of Health Secretary Herrera Scott will be resigning effective February 28th, and that her successor, whose name I meant to put into the presentation but did not, will take office on April the 8th. And in the meantime, there will be an acting secretary. So how will these cuts be discussed in the legislature? So sort of there's two places. One is in the budget. So this sort of series of things at the top, the dedicated hours policy, the geographic differential, the wage exceptions, and the reasonable and customary wages will be those decisions will be made as the legislature approves the budget, debates, and then approves the budget. The pieces on the bottom, the individual and family directed goods and services, the elimination of the list program, and one thing I didn't mention on the previous slide, which is this waiting list equity fund. They're going to shift some money out of the waiting list fund. So rather than moving people from the waiting list into waiver services, instead, they're going to move some of the money that they save there to try to balance the budget. Those decisions will be made through a bill that is called the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act of 2025, which is, you'll hear people refer to it as the BRFA. So the BRFA has all kinds of pieces of different changes that are needed in order to balance the budget. Okay, so before I move on to education, whoops, oh boy. Does anybody have any questions they want to stop me?
I've got one.
Please, Tressa.
It's Tressa. Hey, was wondering whether or not like the impact of this, the woman from the Department of Health, like what's your take on that? Is this a good thing or we don't know yet?
That's probably beyond my purview. I will say, I think my sense from the listening that I've done, and again, the DDA, I think, as you know, is this world is a little beyond me. This is not my area of personal expertise. So what I'm sharing with you is what I'm trying to translate it from listening and experts who have talked to me about it. That she was that the leadership of the Department of Health was difficult, and under her leadership, the breakdown in communication happened, and there was an unwillingness to fix it. I think that is a charitable way of putting it. And I think that it is perceived that there is the possibility that this might be a positive thing.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah.
This is her husband, Sean. Can I have a follow-up question? As far
Please.
as I saw that over the next 2 years, 25, 26, it looks like it's a 22% cut in funding. Is that correct? And I've seen a lot of awareness, through, I still read the Capitol and some other, maybe the only one, but some of the, is that because proportionately this funding is getting hit the most, either from a dollar value or a percentage, or is it more of a story to hear that the disability community is being impacted? So let me kind of rephrase that. Are there other groups, non-disability related, that their budgets are getting hit as proportionally high as, I'll say, we are?
I don't know about proportionally high. It is the case that the DDA is a big state expenditure.
Mhm.
And so there may be others that are getting cut, but it is not, the dollar amounts are much, much smaller. Does that make sense?
Sure,
So
right.
I don't,
Okay.
so it's not getting reported that way.
Yeah, like you hear people say comments like it should be equal cuts across the board. So it's like kind of wondering like where does this fall in line? Just more as a understanding of is everybody getting cut?
I mean, there are cuts, many, many, many places. There are some things that are not being cut, and we'll talk a little bit about that
Okay.
as we move on.
Great. Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm sorry, I'm going to go back here and oh, here we go. Okay. So so cuts to education. So again, this is just overall impact to kids and schools. So this year, the funding for public schools would be cut about $308 million. That's a combination of a couple different things. We'll get into the details in a minute. Over 4 years, it would be $2.8 billion, and over 8 years, $7.3 billion. And interestingly, we talked about with the DDA that the state savings is actually about half. For education, it is also about half, but unlike, it's not a federal match in this case, it's a local jurisdictions match. So the savings to the state in the budget this year would be about $140 million. The other half of that would be coming from locals that then are not contributing that same amount to their schools. And then here's sort of the specifics of what the changes are to the blueprint. So the first and biggest is they're calling it a pause of something called collaborative time for 4 years. In essence, it is a cut to the foundation funding for every student across the state. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about collaborative time in a minute. But a cut to the foundation in the way that the blueprint works is also a cut to the extra funding that students in certain categories get. So the way that blueprint funding works is there is a dollar amount that every student in the state gets. The LEA, their local jurisdiction, gets a certain amount of money. It's about $9,000. Next year, it was supposed to be $9,226. If that student is also eligible for free and reduced price meals, that $9,226 is multiplied times a percentage to get a weight, and that student gets the 9,226 plus the extra layer of funding for being a student who's economically disadvantaged. If that student is also an English language learner, there's another weight. The foundation is multiplied times a percentage, and that student gets that layer of funding. If the student gets special education services, there's another weight. When you cut the foundation, when you cut that $9,226, each one of those other layers is diminished. So the pause of collaborative time, which pulls money out of the foundation, cuts the other layers. In this case, it will not affect the layer for special education funding. We'll talk about that in a minute. So collaborative time is one piece. The two other pieces, one is a freeze of community schools funding. So community schools are funded to provide wraparound support services for students who live in communities with concentrations of poverty. So eligibility for free and reduced price meals is tracked, and schools that have more than 55% of their students who get free and reduced price meals are considered to be schools with high concentrations of poverty. And it's been found through research that those schools need additional resources for students to make progress. So community schools bring in things like they might bring in a food bank, they might bring in a medical clinic, they might bring in after school programming or tutors or additional staff. So that there's a freeze of that funding at the level provided in FY26 for 2 years. And then the last thing is a cut to behavioral health supports, which is supposed to be through the blueprint funded at $130 million a year, and it will be cut to $40 million.
Liz, do you mind sharing your screen again?
Oh no, really?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Thank you. I'm so sorry. I'm just talking and talking and so sorry. Let me see. All right. Can you see it now?
Yes, thank you.
I'm so sorry. All right. So I was talking, but that's the overall impact. And then these are those three buckets: collaborative time, community schools, and behavioral health supports. So I just want to take just a minute to talk about collaborative time because I think there's a lot of confusion around it. And I think it's important to kind of understand what it is and why it's particularly important for students with disabilities. So collaborative time, as envisioned by the blueprint, is time for teachers to work collaboratively, to be together as professionals, to plan instruction, to do professional learning, and to work with individual students and small groups. Across most of the country and here in Maryland right now, the general way breakdown of teacher time is around 80% of a teacher's time is spent with their class, doing the work of instruction, and about 20% of their time is spent in planning. But that planning is typically individual planning time. So it's their planning period plus their lunch, right? Or that kind of thing. The idea in the blueprint is that you would expand the amount of time that teachers spend not teaching a whole class. And so you would move from that 80-20 split to a 60-40 split. And the reason why it was put into the blueprint is because there's a lot of research that shows that schools that invest in collaborative time improve student outcomes, and it increases teacher satisfaction and teacher retention. And there's a big goal of the blueprint that we will diversify and stabilize our teacher workforce. And because we know that that's a way to create great outcomes for kids. I would argue that, and some of you probably don't really know me, but I've been, for the last year and a half, I've been leading a work group with Carrie Wright, the state superintendent, looking at special education across Maryland and making recommendations to the legislature and the state board and the accountability and implementation board that implements the blueprint. And there's not, so I know quite a bit about the blueprint, and I would say, there's really not much programmatically in the blueprint that is specific to students with disabilities. But collaborative time is the strategy in the blueprint that is most advantageous to students with disabilities because many of you have had children with disabilities go through the public school system or are there now. That when general educators and special educators have the time and space to look at data, to think about our students, to plan instruction together, to identify where they have gaps in their own understanding and do professional learning together that they can then turn around and apply back in the classroom when they can work with small groups or individual students. All of that will benefit our kids more than it benefits any other kids. It will benefit all kids, but it will benefit our kids in particular. So collaborative time, I think, is something I take very personally on behalf of students with disabilities as an important value in the blueprint. This little graph on the right just gives you an idea of what that funding change will look like. So it's collaborative time was a pretty small amount of money in FY26, $163 per pupil. And but it escalates quite a bit over time. And by FY33, it would be $1,527. The proposal is that it would be zeroed out for 4 years and then start on the same trajectory in FY30. So it would be $163 in FY30. So just a little bit of context. So the proponents of the governor's proposal say that collaborative time can't be implemented because of the teacher shortage. So that's kind of one of the big things we're up against. The thought in the blueprint was, well, if you're going to have teachers out of the classroom for twice as long as they had been, 40% of the time instead of 20% of the time, who's going to be with the kids? That must mean we're going to have to hire many, many more teachers. And you'll hear people throwing around 15,000 teachers. We need 15,000 more teachers in order to implement collaborative time. So two things. One thing is, if you look back at that graph that we just looked at together, you can see that the idea is that this money is going to grow over time. The $163 per student wouldn't allow us to hire 15,000 teachers. It would allow us to hire about 1,200 teachers. So the idea is that it would grow each year. We would be implementing a little more. We're not going to immediately jump from 80-20 to 60-40. We're going to grow over time. Secondly, there's a lot of ways that you could implement collaborative time without any additional teachers. And in fact, there's a rich research literature about exactly that, how you can build collaborative time right now at a school, regardless of how many teachers you have. There's all kinds of things you could do, especially if you have a little bit of money to do it, so that you could bring in, for instance, a partnership with a community arts organization that could come in, spend some time doing an art project with kids on a weekly basis, twice a week. And during that period of time, that's when teachers are gathering for collaborative time, just as an example. You could bring in armies of tutors, which could be really important while we're implementing the new literacy policy. And while those tutors are working with kids, again, teachers can be doing collaborative time. You can do a lot with schedules. So there's all kinds of ways we could do it if we wanted to. And in fact, the governor's proposal repurposes some of the money that's saved by cutting collaborative time and puts it back into the budget as pilot grants and as recruitment strategies. It's funny because collaborative time actually is an excellent recruitment and retention strategy. So we're taking it out and then we're putting it back in, but in smaller amounts and not systemically across the whole state. The proposal doesn't cut that extra layer of special education funding that I was explaining because it bakes in, well, it doesn't cut that. It makes sure that that part of the funding remains, but students with disabilities will lose a chunk of their foundation funding. And if you're a student with a disability who is also economically disadvantaged, you will lose a piece of your foundation and a piece of your farms eligible student funding. Same if you're an English language learner student. Another sort of really important piece of context is that blueprint costs are already fully covered for this year. So blueprint costs are not coming out of the general fund. So really, there isn't really any need to cut money out of the blueprint as a means of balancing the budget, because the blueprint funds aren't coming out of the budget. They're coming out of a special blueprint fund. And most of the funding for next year's blueprint costs are also covered by the blueprint fund. The problem is that the legislature, when they passed the blueprint, didn't build in enough sources of revenue over time to fund the extra costs of the blueprint. And so after FY27, Um, we have a big structural deficit that is associated specifically with the costs of the blueprint. And then, I'll also just mention one thing that advocates are talking a lot about is something called the Fair Share Plan, which has been reintroduced. Last year it passed the House, but not the Senate, and is a plan for additional revenue. The governor has included a few pieces of the Fair Share Plan in his budget as part of the revenue raising, but not all of them. So there are some things that are left on the table. And then finally, like we talked about, this uncertainty about changes at the federal level. And then, so how will these cuts to the blueprint come before the legislature? There's two pieces. Again, one is a bill that's called Excellence in Maryland Public Schools Act, which is Senate Bill 429 and House Bill 504. And then in the budget, in the aid to education section of the budget. And the reason I'm mentioning how these things will come before the legislature is that those are going to be our opportunities to act. So what can we do? So just in general, there's a lot of things we can do. You can call and email your delegates and your senators. We're going to talk about submitting written testimony. You can join MDAC if you're not yet a member, or Strong Schools Maryland. Around education pieces, you can sign up for alerts from the ARC, from the DD Council, from the Self-Directed Advocacy Network, SDAN. You can participate in some of our World Down Syndrome Day events. One of the things we do is collect letters that we deliver to legislators. So we'll put you on a list and we can send you some information about that. But, up here in the corner, I circled just as a reminder, one of the most important things you can do before you do any of those other things is really just think about how will some of the specific changes that we've talked about impact your family, because that's going to be the key to all of the other communication that you do, is to make it personal. Okay, so here's the timeline for ways that we can act with respect to the cuts to the DDA. So, and again, I'm going to send out these slides because this is a lot of information with dates. So this Thursday is Developmental Disabilities Day, and hopefully some of you are registered. If you are not yet registered but would like to come, there's no more space for formal registration to actually attend the DD Coalition event for DD Day. But if you would like to come and join some legislator meetings, please let me know and head on down to Annapolis to meet up with us, because it's a great day and an overwhelming showing of families is really important. And then we've got a whole series of dates here in the next 2 weeks that include submitting testimony for the budget hearings. So the budget will be heard both in the House and in the Senate. And the dates are here for when we would have to submit testimony for both the House and the Senate. And then also when to submit testimony for the BRFA hearings in the House and the Senate. And then for the blueprint, same very active time here. We have this, I see a mistake here, which is that Monday, it's Monday, February 10th, which is tomorrow, is Blueprint Day. Blueprint Day is traditionally, in the lead up to passing the blueprint in 2020, it was a day when people would go to Annapolis to try to get the legislature to pass the blueprint. Since then, it's been a day when we sort of celebrate the progress of the blueprint. And this year, there'll be a rally on Lawyers Mall tomorrow at 6:30. Would love for you to be there. I will be there speaking, and we'll be just talking about why the blueprint is important and why the commitment to the blueprint is important. And then again, there's sort of a series of dates for submitting testimony and for hearings that you can attend. So there's a whole bunch of things that I'm going to send to you, and we can talk about but what kind of tools you might need in order to jump in. So I will send you the registration link for Blueprint Day, the live stream link so that you can watch the proceedings on DD Day. I have at least one template for testimony for the governor's education bill, and I'll send you that. It also, I think, can just be helpful in thinking about what testimony in general will look like. In order to submit testimony, you need to have a My MGA account. And we can talk a little bit more about that. And there's also a lot of tutorials and things like that online. I'm going to send you the list of deadlines for submitting testimony and the lists of dates and times and locations for attending hearings. But here's the really important thing. You don't have to be a policy expert to provide testimony or to attend meetings and talk to legislators, because what the legislators want to know is what the impact of their decisions will be on your life. And, there are policy people and there's advocacy organizations that are going to dissect the policy, and they're going to, say why this is bad or that's bad, or why they think it should be this way or that way. You don't need to do that. What you need to do is, I understand that you're cutting money from the DDA. This is what my family needs, right? My public school is important to me because X, Y, and Z. Community schools are important to me because of the X, Y, and Z. Your family's connection to these pieces of legislation and to these decisions is what's important. And that's the part that nobody can do but you. So on submitting testimony, so in order to do that, you need to create a MyMGA account. And I mentioned that. I'm going to show you that in a second on the website. You write your testimony. You have to save the file as a PDF. And then testimony always has to be submitted 2 business days before the hearing. So if the hearing is a Tuesday, then the testimony gets submitted on Friday. If the hearing is Wednesday, the testimony is submitted on Monday, and so forth. House testimony has to be submitted between 10 and 6, and Senate testimony gets submitted between 8 and 6. And it's a little bit of a wonky website, and it's a little bit of a it's a little tricky if you've never done it before. It's not tricky, but you just have to. It can be a little bit confusing or a little intimidating if you've never done it before. So, because of that, if you want help, MDAC, in collaboration with Strong Schools Maryland, is hosting some virtual office hours on Monday, February 17th, from 9 to 10 and 12 to 1. And we're doing it specifically to provide assistance for using MyMGA to submit testimony for the Senate Bill 429, which is the education bill. But I also just want to say, we're happy to help anybody navigate that website and learn how to submit testimony so that you can submit testimony for the budget bills. We're happy to help with that as well on the DDA cuts. And there's links to register for those drop-in hours, and I'm going to email that to you as well with the resources. All right, so I'm going to stop my share. And see if anybody has a question. And before we go, I will show you the MGA, how to sign up on the website. Anybody have a question?
I have a question.
Okay.
And it's probably a very novice question. So when you talk about how much would be taken away education-wise, can you tell me, like, in layman's terms, what does that mean in her day-to-day school life? Like, does that mean she's going to have less services available to her, less push in, pull out, greater potential of being put into a secluded classroom?
Yeah.
What does that actually mean?
What a great question, Carrie. So, the way that blueprint funding works is that 75% of the dollar amount that is associated with your student is supposed to go directly to the school where your student is. So I mentioned that sort of $9,000 figure. So about 75% of that $9,000 is supposed to be in your child's school. So $163 of that will be taken out next year and left at the state, right? And then so it'll be about 100 and help me with my math. $120 less will come to the school for your individual child. So then multiply that times, the 25 students in your child's class. So what does that look like? It might look like, you know, curricular materials. It might look like field trips. It might look like, right. I mean, I guess you have to take the small and then aggregate it to try to understand what it actually buys you. But it's right, it's not a direct line, and that does make it tricky. You have to boil it down in some ways to think about what kind of impact. And it's interesting because when my older children were young, was sort of the last time we were really going through school budget battles in the state, especially here in Baltimore City. And we really were operating all the time in a state of scarcity. And it was really clear what that direct line was. After this many years of so much federal funding that went into schools, I think we kind of forget what it's like to be in schools with that much scarcity. But it will have a direct impact on kids. And because that money escalates so much year to year, so I think I mentioned it's about in the just the category of collaborative time, it's 218 million this year. And then next year, it's 438 million. And then the next year, 666 million. So it goes up, a lot what that cost is. And yeah, how individual schools and school districts will decide to trim costs. I mean, I think one way we know that they're going to trim costs is they're going to raise class sizes. And I think that's always a go-to. And I think one of the things we know is that when our kids are in larger and larger classes, it's less and less likely that they'll get their needs met.
One of the things I just like to comment on, one of the things when I follow and I think about all of my parents were educators, and one of the things that I know that the county in Anne Arundel does to trim costs when there seems to be a shortage of money is they just aggregate resources. And so what does that mean is they have one classroom, they have one school. And in that one classroom is where you're going to find the special educators and your TAs. Instead of having them spread through different classrooms and different school options, they aggregate everything to make it more cost effective. And so I do think that is an impact with time that we will see, is just less options because there are less available resources.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was one of the reasons why when I heard some legislators talking about how students with disabilities were being held harmless by them making sure that layer for students with disabilities funding was kept whole, and not tied to the foundation anymore. It was bothersome to me exactly for the reason you're mentioning, Tressa, which is that
Well, it's a sneaky way around it. You know, there's, I don't, yeah, I'm not buying that, to be
I
honest.
mean, right,
Yeah.
because it just
Yeah.
means it is not an acknowledgement that we know that for our students, the best way to improve the education for students with disabilities is to improve general education classrooms. And so when you take money out of general education, you are very much hurting students with disabilities, and you're making it more likely that they are going to end up getting served somewhere else.
Yes, where the resources are.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So, yeah.
Other thoughts or questions, and any particular resources that okay, hold on, let's see. I have a couple of questions. What are the chances the government will be successful in raising taxes and get rid of the cuts? I think that there is going to be a lot of, that's a great question. I think there will be a lot of there's going to be a lot of changes between now and the end of session. I mean, I don't think that the proposal that is out right now is what's going to get passed. Do I think that we realistically are going to restore all of these cuts? No, I do not. And in fact, one of the things that we're hearing from legislators is this question of, well, what do you think we should cut? And that's really problematic, right? Because that's not our decision, and it's a way of sort of manufacturing consent that we are agreeing, and that's not our job. Our job is to advocate for the populations and the groups and the and our interests, and to tell our stories. And it's the job of legislators to figure out how to make it all work. I'm going to stop this recording.